we're at I think, a pretty important point in the evolution of our collective understanding of the challenges that this issue creates for global companies, that everybody understands the words of human trafficking and forced labor, but not necessarily the impacts or the challenges that this issue creates.
Human trafficking doesn't always take the form we first imagine. It can be found at almost any level of an organization's supply chain. What can compliance professionals do to assess human trafficking risk, and how can they leverage the resources of the organizations they work for to help root out this tragic problem? Gwen Hassan is here to help. This is Hidden Traffic.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Hidden Traffic. I am your host, Gwen Hassan. I'm very excited today to have Jackson Wood with me. He works in global trade intelligence for Descartes. Welcome. Thanks for coming, Jackson.
Thank you very much for having me, Gwen. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So let's start at the beginning. Tell us a bit about Descartes and, how did you come to work for them, and a little bit about yourself and your background.
Sure. So maybe I'll start with my journey through global trade compliance and risk management, because it sort of dovetails with the Descartes story. So like a lot of folks who I've encountered in the compliance and risk management space, I sort of came to this domain somewhat by accident. So I had studied law, and I did my undergraduate in law and was planning to be an attorney, and very specifically a constitutional lawyer here. I'm based in Canada, and so I'm Canadian, educated in Canada. And because I had always been interested in the big idea, right, with public policy implications, Canada is we have socialized medicine. We have a long history of strong public policy instruments. And so
just say it, you're far better than the United States.
No, it's not a qualitative assessment at all, Gwen. It's just context. It's just some context. And so I was going to be a constitutional lawyer. And when I finished my undergraduate degree, frankly, I was just fatigued with the world of academia. And I wanted to go out and actually try to get a job. And so I started my career working at Xerox in their contracts department. So even though I wasn't a lawyer with my legal background, it positioned me well to come in and learn about some of the legal infrastructure and some of the process pieces that a large global corporation uses to manage their business. And you might wonder, well, what's the connection there with global trade and compliance and risk? And I think it was my first exposure to the importance of strong due diligence, transparency, attention to detail in terms of how organizations manage risk. So I did that for 3 years, and then very serendipitously ended up getting a job at a small technology company here in Toronto, Canada, called MSR. And MSR was really the first company in Canada to create digital tools that allowed importers in Canada to act as self-filing entities. So rather than relying purely on customs brokers or other intermediaries to clear their shipments into Canada, MSR's technology enabled them to do that themselves. So I joined when the organization was, about 45 to 50 people. We had almost all the large importers in Canada working with our technology. And so that was a real crash course learning for me and the intricacies of global trade, product classification, documentation, regulatory filings, et cetera. And I'd been there 2 or 3 years, and we had sort of been dipping our toe into the US marketplace. And we sort of caught lightning in a bottle with a restricted party screening solution called Visual Compliance. And this was brought to the market just after September 11th and the introduction of the Patriot Act, and really that sort of big bang of awareness and requirements for US companies in particular to be doing much more due diligence on their customers and their third parties they were working with all around the world. And we really invested in creating that as the de facto solution for third-party due diligence, whether that's sanctioned, debarred, restricted party screening, product classification, and license determination management, et cetera. And very quickly, we established a market-leading position. Some of the customers that I helped on board in 2003, 2004 are still with us today. And I think I take a lot of pride in that. And I know our team takes a lot of pride in that because it's not easy to maintain a business relationship over that amount of time. And so that's sort of how I ended up in this space. My connection to Descartes, again, happened quite serendipitously. So I left MSR in 2011 to go and spend some time in Canada's healthcare system. I just needed a bit of a change of pace. And as I'd mentioned, I had always been interested in the big ideas and big public policy pieces. And so I went and I just learned a whole new industry, a whole new area of subject matter, working with clinicians instead of engineers or trade attorneys. Mm-hmm. But healthcare and trade compliance are much more similar than you might think. Heavily regulated, a lot of complex regulatory instrumentation, a lot of varied stakeholders with competing agendas. And I was actually quite surprised at how similar my experience working with clinicians and hospital administrators was to working with executives and business leaders and compliance attorneys in the private sector. And so I did that for about 8 or 9 years. And then Descartes bought MSR Visual Compliance. And it all comes full circle, and an opportunity to rejoin the business was presented to me and happily took it. So this is where I'll now try to tell a quick story of Descartes. So Descartes is a leading technology company here in Canada. It was founded in Waterloo, Ontario in the early 80s. And Waterloo is sort of like Canada's Silicon Valley. So the University of Waterloo has always been a real hub for technological innovation. And so Descartes' founding concept or premise was this piece of technology called the Global Logistics Network. And it was envisioned to be a connector across all the intermediaries that worked in global supply chains. So whether those were shippers, consignees, forwarders, customs brokers, regulatory agencies, et cetera. At that time, there was no unified way for all of those parties to collaborate, share information, et cetera. And so the Global Logistics Network was established as the platform to enable global trade and logistics supply chain digitization. And so over time, Descartes has built on top of, we call it the GLN, the Global Logistics Network, has built functional capabilities that enable and digitize almost every element of the global logistics and supply chain environment. So whether that's warehousing, transportation management, we enable organizations with their own fleets of vehicles to optimize the performance of those fleets. We're working a lot with customers now, reducing their carbon footprint. So they're optimizing the performance of those fossil fuel consuming assets, driver safety, et cetera. So e-commerce fulfillment, we support regulatory filings. We enable customs brokers and freight forwarders with the systems that they run their businesses on. And then the part of the business that I'm in, global trade intelligence, we really help companies in 3 ways. We help them extract market insights from global trade data. So understanding, hey, where can we best source our raw materials? Where are the most optimal trade lanes for us to take advantage of? We also help them digitize and automate key elements of the global trade process, so whether that's documentation, product classification, regulatory filings like ES or EEI in the US as examples, and then our compliance and risk management practice, which is where we likely have the most resonance for our conversation today, which is really enabling our customers to do the appropriate level of not only regulatory due diligence, like screening for restricted, debarred, or sanctioned parties, but also on the reputational due diligence side. So I always talk about compliance and risk on a spectrum. At one end, there are the things you can't do, and at the other end, there are the things that you probably shouldn't do. And so I always try to help our customers, particularly new customers that we're working with, recognizing that just covering your bases purely on the regulatory side is obviously a good place to start, but that doesn't mean that your due diligence work is finished, particularly as we continue to hear more and more organizations prioritizing things like ESG or environmental social governance concerns, environmental protection, et cetera. So our compliance and risk management capabilities really work across that spectrum and help organizations maintain compliance with regulatory requirements, but also protect their image and reputation in the global marketplace. So that's a quick sort of functional look at Descartes, we're over 2,000 global employees. We're approaching 26,000 global customers. So we really do, I think, have not only the tenure, having been around for the better part of 30 years, but also the capabilities and the expertise to help all kinds of companies and all kinds of industries really do the best they can in their logistics and supply chain operations.
That overview is so helpful because I was familiar with Descartes, but I was familiar with you as a customs broker. That was kind of my background. And I didn't even realize that you had this whole other global trade intelligence offering and that it included compliance, and it makes a clear intersection now with the topic of this podcast, of course, which is human trafficking prevention. So as you know, we became acquainted because of a webinar that Descartes participated in on human trafficking prevention. So talk to us a little bit, tell our listeners a bit about kind of the work in that area and what Descartes is doing. I saw you just published a new guide, actually, on human trafficking.
Yeah. We just published a resource. White paper is a bit of a generic term, but really it's more intended to be a general education and awareness piece on the issues of human trafficking and forced labor in the global supply chain. And we're at I think, a pretty important point in the evolution of our collective understanding of the challenges that this issue creates for global companies, that everybody understands the words of human trafficking and forced labor, but not necessarily the impacts or the challenges that this issue creates. And so with our forced labor guide, we're trying to help define some generic terminology, attach some statistics, attach some real evidence to help organizations and individuals, frankly, become a little bit more informed about why this is such a critical issue for us to take collective action on. Also, too, as I've talked with our customers or prospective customers about the challenge of forced labor, there's a real intimidation factor of, yeah, we get it, this is an important issue, but where do we even start?
Yeah.
It's very overwhelming because if you think of traditionally, let's talk about sanctions as an example. So sanctioned parties traditionally were identified by government agencies, their names were put on a list. And so all your due diligence really encompassed was screening your third parties against those lists.
Looking for matches. Yeah.
Looking for matches. And if you didn't get any matches, then you were probably okay to do business with that party. And you had your demonstration of reasonable care in the form of a paper trail saying, hey, we didn't accept any money from this entity, or we didn't exchange any intellectual property with this entity until we verified that it wasn't on a sanctioned, restricted, or debarred party list. And so what I think has got people's heads spinning a little bit about this is, with the exception of a very limited entity list that has been published by the US government for the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act.
Right.
I mean, I think we're talking of the last time I checked, less than 50 entities on that list. And there are thousands of entities operating in the Xinjiang region of China. And so if they're not one of those 50, how do you know whether or not they're going to be involved with or associated with forced labor? You don't. And so the due diligence burden now falls on you as a compliance professional, and by extension, your organization, to do everything you can to determine whether forced labor is involved in the production of these particular products. And so I think companies recognize, and individual compliance practitioners recognize, the importance of this issue, but are really struggling to put together a programmatic approach to addressing the risk. And the other comparison I would make, Gwen, is probably, I can't remember the exact date, but when the OFAC 50% ownership rule started to pick up awareness 3, 4, 5 years ago, a lot of companies had the exact same reaction because OFAC wasn't publishing an exhaustive list of individuals and entities that were implicated in the foreign ownership rule. Yeah. And so companies had to start doing their own due diligence, and it was really hard. And this is an example of why we work with specialized partners like Caron, who we participated in the webinar with. We also work with Dow Jones on this space, where these companies have utilized their unique expertise, their unique networks, to create these custom lists that government regulators aren't creating, that at least give companies a starting point for their due diligence on the 50% ownership rule. And so that's where I think, and what we talked about in the webinar was forced labor is another example of the government's not really setting us up for success here by trying to help us execute our due diligence. So we're going to have to rely on our own ingenuity, our own skills, and then relationships with companies like Descartes, Caron, Dow Jones, who specialize in filling in the gaps that are presented by the lack of coverage from a regulatory perspective. And so what we're trying to advise our customers on is, hey, there is a starting point for an appropriate level of due diligence on forced labor risk, utilizing a solution like ours, like our third-party due diligence platform, augmented by the data that Caron or Dow Jones provide that identify high-risk entities on whether it's sanctioned ownership, whether it's military end use, military intelligence end use, or forced labor. And as more and more of our customers are engaging with us on the solution, they're actually pleasantly surprised to find out, like, hey, we really went from 0 to 60 miles an hour, probably almost overnight, in terms of our ability to do this type of risk assessment and due diligence from a forced labor perspective. It's not to say that the work is done. It's not to say that it's the perfect solution, but boy, oh boy, it's better than trying to sort of rub two sticks together in your own office and put together a plan.
Yeah, better than an Excel spreadsheet and a pencil, which is a lot of people are starting, honestly. And not limited only to the forced labor issue and the Uyghur issue, but now, of course, we're seeing the German Supply Chain Act, the new proposed European Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive that will require broad human rights due diligence throughout the supply chain back to source. So when you talk to people in industry, they literally are scratching their heads like, well, how am I supposed to prioritize my entire supply chain for human rights due diligence? And where do I start? And what do I do? To your point, I think for me anyway, trade seems like kind of a natural jumping off point. As we use the example of OFAC screening, people understand that. And if you can use that as an entree into kind of the conversations with your C-suite and your board about why it's important, you can leverage kind of existing buy-in, theoretically, that the company has around that function to expand, to start looking at forced labor, to start looking at human rights issues. Have you seen clients of yours using trade as kind of the lead?
Yeah. And I would say it's certainly on the forced labor side, but I would also say on broader ESG related topics or corporate social responsibility topics, sometimes organizations are a little bit paralyzed by where does this fit? Is this a regulatory? Is it a financial compliance issue? Is it a governance issue? And what I think has happened is, and it was, I would say, accelerated very much by the Russia-Ukraine conflict, where folks that were toiling away in the trade compliance or the compliance risk and ethics functions all of a sudden had a spotlight on them as the main vehicle to protect the organization from risk exposure in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And I know in conversations with some of our customers, particularly long-serving trade compliance leaders who, you know, maybe in the 20 years that they'd worked at their company had never once had a meeting with the CEO, we're all of a sudden now having weekly briefings with the CEO and the broader executive team on, hey, what are we doing to make sure that we don't contravene any of these new regulations from a Russia or Ukraine perspective? And so I think the responsiveness, I think the diligence, I think the skills of folks practicing in the compliance realm, trade compliance in particular, really got the attention of executive leadership in these organizations and said, hey, this is a natural place for us to start building some of these additional due diligence or compliance functions on top of. And so we have seen a very significant level of engagement from our trade compliance customers saying, hey, I've been tasked with our forced labor due diligence or our broader supply chain mapping undertaking. And I do think that it's partly a product of the fact that these folks tend to have very strong research and analytic skills, very strong multi-stakeholder management skills. There's familiarity with varying government regulatory tools. So
they tend to have a global mindset too.
Absolutely.
So
that's a great way to put it. And there's also a bit of resilience that has been built into trade compliance teams, whether that's the volatility in global tariffs, duties, taxes, free trade agreements coming and going, quotas. The volatility and the complexity from a trade compliance perspective is something that those of us who've been in the space long enough know is just table stakes. That's just how it is.
For many people, part of what the joy of this area of practice is it's always something new. You never know.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think compliance folks for a long time have struggled to communicate the value that they and their teams offer to the organization. A former colleague of mine here at Descartes, who was a compliance leader at a large global corporation, said his team used to be referred to as the sales prevention team.
Oh.
And so much more of a friction in the business than an enabler of the business. That perception is starting to change. More and more organizations are starting to recognize that an investment and a commitment to compliance is an enabler of growth. It's an enabler and an accelerator of brand equity. It's, hey, we're an organization that takes this stuff seriously. And from a purely commercial perspective, if you're strong on the compliance, supply chain management, risk mitigation side, you're going to be able to work in markets that are very challenging, that some of your competitors might just say, you know what, we're not going to be there because we can't deal with the regulatory challenges presented by that jurisdiction. It's a long-winded answer to your question, but I absolutely see trade compliance professionals, trade compliance teams as really the key leverage point for organizations to deal with some of these wicked challenges like human trafficking and forced labor.
Agreed. That was my entry into it as well. I mean, I was practicing in trade compliance and then kind of blended into corporate compliance, which then led into defense contracting compliance, which then led to human trafficking because the DFAR were revised here in the U.S. as one of the first regulations that really came out requiring companies that were contracted with the federal government to have a prevention program and a housing program and a poster and a hotline and all of the things. So I think it's a logical extension, to your point, of people that already have the skill set, merely leveraging it in a new area.
Yep.
That's of crucial importance and increasingly of more and more importance given the rapid changes of the laws that we're seeing. A number of people I've talked to have predicted that the Uyghur Forced Labor Act in the U.S. is kind of the tip of the iceberg, and that we'll start to see Europe pass a similar type of rule, that it may expand outside of Xinjiang, that we may be looking at whether it spreads to Tibet, whether it spreads to places, other locations within China. So I think the likelihood that the skill set is going away is very low. This is something that I think we'll see a lot more of as we go forward. So opportunities for trade compliance and for you.
I absolutely agree. When I reflect on 20 plus years of working with customers, working with global regulators, working with intermediaries, et cetera, I think supply chains have sort of gone through these epochs, if you will, where through the 70s and the early 80s, it was all about, hey, how do we actually get our products for the lowest possible cost? And so that's where we really saw the beginning of the establishment of these really complex global supply chains. And then we got into the just in time. It wasn't enough to just be able to get it for the lowest cost. It was now about, hey, can we get it as quickly as possible so that we don't have to carry a lot of inventory and download as many costs and as many complexities onto our suppliers as possible. And I think we're entering this new epoch, which is really going to be about greater intimacy, greater transparency with all of these parties across the supply chain. It's not enough for it to be the lowest cost in the shortest amount of time anymore. We are in a world now where, of course, those things matter, but far more important is going to be, hey, how are we collectively building a more sustainable future for, this can sound a bit hyperbolic, but a sustainable future for our civilization, because the impact that global supply chains have from a emissions perspective, the impact that supply chains have from a labor and a social perspective, the impact they have on infrastructure in companies or in countries, it's huge.
It's huge.
And so I do think that we're entering this new era of, hey, how do we actually create transparent, trust-based supply chains? And I think that this element of trust is the really big paradigm shift where, again, it used to be enough to say, hey, look, I'll come and visit your factory in China or India or Turkey, and, I'll meet you and I'll see okay, yeah, you're a legitimate business. I feel comfortable doing a deal with you and we'll shake hands and that'll be good. But that's not enough anymore, because there's not enough intimacy just in a single visit. And sometimes in person, frankly, it's hard to ask the tough questions. And so the standard operating procedures and the tools that are now starting to come out are about being able to maintain a productive relationship, but also ask for some sort of proof that some of these issues are on the radar of your supplier or their supplier or their supplier's supplier, and that they're doing something to mitigate that risk in their business. And when I do talk to someone who's trying to wrap their heads around this, starting point that I will sometimes try to give is just start asking the questions. And that's, I think, collectively the biggest thing that we can all start doing is saying, hey, human trafficking and forced labor are very significant issues. Millions of people's lives are compromised by these practices. The least we can do is to start asking our partners for where it is on their radar and what they're doing to mitigate that risk to their business, their customers, their suppliers, et cetera. And if we can all just mobilize and say collectively as business leaders, compliance professionals, you name it, that our commitment going forward is going to be to ask about these things, we'll make significant progress on the issue.
Just have the conversation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Agreed.
So
thank you so much for your time today, Jackson. If people want to continue the conversation with you or learn more about Descartes, how can they get in touch with you?
Reach out to me by email is probably the best way. So my email address is jwood@descartes.com. Check out our web properties. So we have visualcompliance.com, which is going to direct you to all of the resources for our restricted, denied, sanctioned party screening solutions, including our capabilities on forced labor due diligence. Obviously, check out Descartes.com for any of our broader capabilities in logistics and supply chain automation. I think this is a topic that we are going to be collectively as a community talking about in the weeks and the months ahead. And like you, I'm expecting more and more formal regulatory actions to continue to fall into place that are really going to accelerate the efforts that organizations need to make in this area. So it's been a real pleasure speaking with you today, Gwen. I'm grateful for the opportunity, and I'm sure our paths will cross again soon.
Thank you. The pleasure is mine, Jackson. Thanks. Take care.
Take care.